welcome to the podcast. I've finally found the time to sit down and record this one. I've been thinking about doing it for a while. So if you're listening, you've probably got an interest in tiles. It's not the kind of podcast tile that somebody clicks on by accident. So I decided to do this. Like I said, I've been thinking about it for a while. I decided to do this one because I've been in the industry for a few years now. And every time I'm on my travels, or in the past when I've been on my travels, I do take an interest in the things that I see. So if I'm in a particular city or a particular place, I'll probably take an interest and end up Googling, where am I? Where's this place that I'm actually currently sitting in at the moment? And then I'll start looking at the history of the place. And invariably, you can link history to tiles. I mean, tiles have been around for so long, and they're good for historians because they're very robust as well, so they can actually pick them up and see them and look at them and study them and look at the history of them. An example of one thing that got my mind whirring once was on one of the visits that I used to take to Valencia, to the tile show called Sevisama, the Sevisama tile show. We were having a drink outside after the show, so in the street. And we were like outside a church, and I was like, that's a cool looking place. So while everyone was having a drink, I'd just get up and go for a walk and look around this church. And what it actually was Valencia Cathedral. So I was having a look around, and then I ended up Googling it and reading about it. And reading about the area, and finding out the area used to be a Muslim area about 1,000 years ago. And some of the mosques were replaced and converted into churches. And Valencia Cathedral was one of them. And it wasn't even a mosque at first. It was originally a Visigothic cathedral, converted to a mosque, and then converted to, or knocked down, and a Catholic church was built on that site. So it was James I, James the Conqueror, James of Aragon, or Jaime el Conquistador. He conquered that region and made it Catholic again when it was originally Muslim. So I said, like, visiting a tile show, learning the history of the area. Tile manufacturing was actually done in that area under the Islamic rule, all that 1,000 years ago. So they introduced all these different ways of making tiles, and they made the area quite famous for it. And it still is to this day. So I'd walked off from my colleagues, and they were all sitting having a beer or whatever. And when I got back, I was like, did you know that church there used to be a mosque when this region was ruled by Muhammad al-Azraq? And they were like, yeah, fascinating. So I was like, So it's just the kind of thing that I'm into. So, like I said, I've been thinking about doing a podcast like this for a while, but it takes a lot of research, and I have to find the time to actually sit down, do the research, make it make sense, and then talk into this microphone so people can hear me. Valencia is a good place, actually, because I went there so often. It's got a massive, big, rich history of tiling. Another good place to visit in Valencia is the National Museum of Ceramics. It's in a place called Palace of Marquis dos Aguas. It's just the building's amazing. You can just stand outside the building and just look at the entrance. You don't even have to go in. It's an unbelievably beautiful place to look at. But then, obviously, if you go inside, there's a lot of tiles, and I think they've got like fabrics and stuff in there as well. It's not just ceramics. It's an arts museum, but mostly ceramics. So yeah, I like to like I say, if you stand in front of that building, I like to stand in front of, like, in historical places. So sometimes even in, like, I'll be in a forest somewhere with the kids or whatever, and you just stand there and think someone else was standing here like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and they were looking at the same thing that you're looking at right now. And I don't know why, it just gets me thinking, like, we've been generally the same people for thousands of years. Like, we weren't that different. So as a person, we're not that much different. And I would think, like, what would it be like to talk to that person? What would I talk to them about? I went to Tamworth Castle with the kids recently, and this is another place where I did it. I climbed to the top with the kids, and I was like, fuck. So I was looking over the top of the castle, I was thinking, somebody stood here firing arrows or throwing things at fucking Vikings or Danes or whatever about 1,000 years ago. So, and then it gets you thinking, like, is 1,000 years that long ago? Like, so somebody like me, probably younger than me, firing fucking arrows from the top of this exact place down there where there's an ice cream van now. So 1,000 years, I looked it up. So 1,000 years is roughly like 15 or 16 granddads ago. So your 15th great grandfather, which is not that long ago, could have been butchered by a Viking, and it's not that long far away either. So technically, could have been for me. So maybe, I don't know, maybe my 16th grandfather was a Viking. I think I'd prefer that. I don't know. These kind of things I think about, they blow your fucking mind, really, if you think about it. It's so long ago, but not really that long ago. So 16 granddads ago, fighting Vikings. Maybe. So anyway, Valencia. So that whole region of Spain, massively important to the tile industry to this day. And we'll cover it a little bit later in the podcast. So yeah, I like history. I like tiles. So let's talk about the history of tiles. So it has to be an abridged version. I'll probably miss bits out. I'll definitely miss bits out. It's hard to include everything. It's such a long period of time. We're talking like 6,000 years. So we'll discuss tiles and not tiling. We'll probably touch on some elements of tiling, but this is the history of tiling itself. So the history of tiles, the history in tiling itself could be another podcast probably. So as I mentioned, we're going to span about 6,000 years. So I'll definitely miss things out. So if I do miss things out, and somebody wants to come on and talk to me about it, get in touch, come on and talk to me about the things that I missed out or the things that I get wrong, because I probably will. So 6,000 years it's going to cover. So we're going to go from Egyptian handmade terracotta and limestone to modern porcelain wonders such as Wick's Everest. So first of all, so what is a tile? So the tiles that we're going to talk about is what we would think of as like bathroom and kitchen tiles. So there's lots and lots of different types of tiles, right? But the ones that we're going to talk about, what are they? So it's generally a thin, flat slab or block, and generally used decoratively or as protection on the inside or outside of buildings. So it'll be a glazed or unglazed clay. So they fire the clay, glazed or unglazed, and then so different clays and additives are used to create different types of tiles. So for example, a denser clay with materials such as feldspar, quartz or silica is used to make porcelain tiles, which we know are more hard wearing and far less porous than basic ceramic tile. You'll also see sometimes where people say, right, so ceramic is porcelain, right? So everything's ceramic, but we tend to split it ceramic and porcelain, with porcelain being the more hard-wearing, and there's certain things that make ceramic a porcelain. And you'll often see water absorption mentioned. So porcelain is going to have 0.5% or less water absorption. So this means that the tile absorbs 0.5% or less of its own weight in water when it's put through the water absorption test. So that means that the material is submerged in boiling water usually for around 2 hours. A ceramic water absorption would be 4+%. So I've had this conversation a few times in tile shops or various people, where people will tell me that porcelain isn't waterproof because of that 0.5%, and I don't think they fully understood what it actually means. It doesn't mean that the tiles are not waterproof. It means they'll absorb some water if it's allowed to get to them. So it would usually get through porous grout, cracks, and probably most commonly leaks. And then we're getting into the realms of the best substrates and to use and blah blah blah. But that's for another day, another conversation. So water can't actually get through the actual tile face. There are some exceptions with the most porous unglazed materials, but they'd be sealed and maintained anyway to reduce staining and colour. It's a slightly different conversation. So Tiles, they're a functional building material, and they're used to protect buildings from weather. They're applied to interior to make the floors, walls, ceilings more hygienic. It's easier to clean or fireproof. There are all these uses, so they can be functional for all those things that I've just listed, but also purely decorative. They can be used purely for artistic reasons, if people want them to be. So you'll find tiles in all museums and everywhere in the world. And it's because they've been used for thousands and thousands of years for artistic expression. So you can tell a story with them, keep a record, and we can actually use them to study the various cultures who actually made those tiles at the time. And this is like, I can stand in Valencia and say, yeah, this used to be a Muslim area, and they introduced tiles to this area. And it's quite easy for me to find that out, but that's because historians have been able to study it. Those tiles they're still around. They can either study the actual materials or study the stories that the tiles are telling them. So it's extremely robust. Like there is virtually nothing else as robust as a tile historically. So it'll outlast wood, iron, stone. It just outlasts everything. And if they've been well made, which they did start to make tiles quite a long time ago, so the colours even stay. They don't fade over time. They may fade a little bit, but we can tell what colour it was. And then a bit later on, when they made them really well, the colours just don't fade. So those are all the reasons why they've always been used in construction and in art for thousands of years. So around 4000 BC, so 6,000 years ago we're starting, we can find the first example of fired clay, and it was in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So modern day Mesopotamia would be Iraq, Kuwait, parts of Iran, Syria, Turkey. So the Egyptian Empire, it was an interesting part of history itself. It's one of the longest reigning empires. Lasted about 3,000 years. It was broken up with various falls and rises, but the culture of ancient Egypt, it was around for roughly 3,000 years before the Greeks and ultimately the Romans took over. And actually they both like tiles as well, and we'll get to that. So the Egyptians, they will have fired clay at high temperatures and used bricks and tiles to protect the exterior of buildings. So the very basics of tile manufacturing, it's not changed that much in 6,000 years, and by the time we get to the end of this, we'll see what the differences are. Obviously, we do it a lot better these days, and there's been lots of innovations and technologies, but the basic principles of it still pretty much the same. So the Egyptians, they will have been like highly skilled, and I mean like highly fucking skilled stonemasons. They would create like huge stones and then etch hieroglyphics onto them. So they would have used clay from the Nile. When they fired it, it would have turned like this distinctive red-brown colour. Clay from the desert called moor clay, that was used to fire to a cream or a white colour. It contained a higher calcium content. And this is when the Egyptians possibly accidentally discovered glazing. So moor clay, it would develop like a thin layer of salt on the surface when it was fired, and then when it was fired at really high temperatures, the layer, it would turn an olive green glaze. And then obviously they noticed this, and then that prompted them to experiment with other materials to create like a wider range of colours and finishes. So these experiments, they developed like an early form of tin glazing. It was called faience. It's like an early form of tin glazing, where they would heat up materials to a vitrified state, and meaning the material was covered in like a glass-like substance which was then used to create these colourful tiles and jewellery and friezes. Friezes were like pieces of art, and they would use to like record history or decorate their temples and things like that. So yeah, the Egyptians like were unbelievable stonemasons. skills that we've probably lost now. They were like more skilled than we even could imagine. So they worked extensively with like granite, travertine, limestone. Materials that even to this day they're like sought after materials and considered like high end, or if you can work with them, you're a very skilled person. So like a famous one, like even the Great Pyramid, it was covered in like highly polished white limestone. I think a lot of people will be aware of that by now. So before the pyramids looked like they did today, they were covered in like a polished limestone, and it would have been like white. So when the sun was shining, it would reflect, and the sun would reflect from these highly polished tiles, and you could see it from miles away. So in the late 19th century, there was an English Egyptologist, Flinders Petrie, and he commented on the precision. So they were looking at it then, and they were like, not sure how. Still to this day, we're not sure how they did it, but they weren't sure then. And this guy commented that. So Flinders Petrie, he commented at the time like these stones are like equal to opticians' work of today, of their present time, like, but on a scale of like acres. And this is a quote: "To place such stones in exact contact would be careful work, but to do so with the cement in the joints seems almost impossible." End quote. So we've always been confused in how they did it, and if you just forget about all the theories of what it could have been, aliens and all that crap, it could have been, but we don't know. These guys, whoever was doing it, they were like supremely highly skilled, which is like crazy skills that we couldn't do it today. Maybe we could get machines to do it, but I believe even with machines, they're not quite sure how they would do it, so it's unbelievable really what they were doing. The limestone tiles that were covering the pyramid, they might actually still be there if it wasn't for an earthquake. The earthquake around the year 1300, it loosened some of them, and then they were just removed over time by various sultans, and then they will have used them to build mosques in the surrounding areas. The earliest examples of fired clay is Mesopotamia. You can see examples of this today if you wanted to. If you go to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, there's tiles dated around 3600 BC, fired clay. It was not actually tile shaped, it was more of a cone shape. And so they would fire the clay into a cone shape and then push it like a nail into pillars, and the pillars were made from mud and reeds. So then it would kind of, the flat of the cone would be on around the pillar, and it would protect the pillar from the elements. So from the surface, it would look like lots and lots of circles, like geometric patterns, and they would actually make patterns out of it as well. So it would look like a mosaic from the front, but it's actually a cone that's been pushed in. So it's believed that the complexity of firing clay meant that rectangular shapes or bricks, they came later on when they finessed the firing technology. So another example that's at the Pergamon Museum, they've got the Ishtar Gate, and this was decorated with glazed bricks, and it shows like lions and bulls and dragons, and you got like orange, yellow, white. Amazing. There's like a stunning blue background, and they took this from an area, so it's in Berlin, but they took it from an area of Mesopotamia called Babylon. So you know the Hanging Gardens, and that area, Babylon, it's in Iraq now, or modern day Iraq. But the Ishtar Gate, it's from around 575 BC, and you can see it in the Pergamon Museum. So there's lions, bulls, dragons, and these were they were actually press molded to create reliefs. And the design was extremely intricate designs. They had to account for joints in relation to the shape and the design of the art, so the molds were reusable. There must have been some kind of early production line to ensure that the bricks were made to the correct quantities and of a high quality. So yeah, the rectangle tiles, they were all different. So they'd like reliefs or moulds on them that they would put them all together, and they'd make like images of lions or dragons over quite large areas, and there'd be like a bull, but that bull would be made out of 100 or so small rectangle tiles. So there must have been some kind of early production line to make sure these bricks were made correct to the correct quantities and of like quite a high quality. Interesting thing about Babylon. So Babylon is literally a lost city. It was abandoned and then rediscovered by German archaeologists. Hence, the Pergamon Museum houses all these reconstructions. It's got, amongst other things, it's got that it's imported from ancient world. So, which is a little controversial actually, whether these things should be returned to where they were found. And it's still debated to this day, daily probably. Every now and again you'll see it flare up. So it's not unlike artifacts found in other museums, not that far away from here. So it's controversial. Maybe they should return them. Maybe they saved them in the first place. We don't know. So the fabled Hanging Gardens is one of the 7 wonders. It's the only one of the 7 wonders that has no definitive evidence, and it's like debatable whether it actually existed at all. So after the Mesopotamians, we get the Greeks, and they would mark the beginning of what we now refer to as the classical Greco-Roman era. So this era, we saw like a boom in art, architecture, engineering. The Greeks' expansion, this was led by Alexander the Great, and it will have started about 336 BC. So he will have defeated the Persians, and he will have created colonies in Italy, conquered Egypt, and that's where obviously you get the famous city of Alexandria, Alexander the Great. The most famous Greek architectural style is the post and lintel stone structures. So obviously a lot of them survive to this day and we can see them. So the Greeks were perhaps the first to use roof tiles, so they will have used terracotta tiles fixed to the slopes of roofs of these buildings. And they developed lots of different types of roof tiles in the time, and they introduced things like ridge tiles and guttering. They would cover gaps on the eaves with special decorative tiles, and these are known as antifixa. Some of these tiles, they survive to this day. As I say, they're considered works of art, and they're mainly tiles made by the Etruscans. They will have adopted the methods in Italy before the Romans took over. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, this is when Greece started to divide, and over many years, member states that just fight with each other, and this is when you saw the decline of ancient Greece. All of this time, Rome was rising. There were lots and lots of wars during this period, so Rome steadily gaining control and Greece officially becoming part of the Roman Republic in 146 BC. The Romans would occupy the whole of the Greek world from 31 BC, when Cleopatra, the Greek queen of Egypt, was defeated. In 30 BC, Alexandria was conquered. And it was just before these two victories that the Roman Republic had become the Roman Empire. Augustus was the emperor and the founder of the Roman Empire. So even though Rome now ruled the Greek world, the Greeks generally continued in pretty much the same way as they had before. And it was actually the Roman culture that was heavily influenced by the Greeks. So yeah, the Greco-Roman period of tiles is perhaps most famous for its mosaics. Although the use of mosaics is actually older than the Greeks or the Romans. They are most associated with it, because the extensive use and development of the form, we can still see it today. They've got some amazing things that have survived to this day. So initially only really available to royalty, mosaics were eventually used by virtually everyone, even people of the most modest means. Greek mosaics were made from worn down chotoli pebbles. Through the years, they'd learned how to arrange the pebbles, chotoli, to show shading and make designs look like really quite realistic. They would introduce strips of lead to define the lines within the designs, and then eventually they had a breakthrough of using stone coloured glass, and obviously this introduced much brighter colours and realism to the designs. So even though they were able to create these amazing designs, it was really important that the mosaics were functional, as they were being used for flooring, paths, ceilings, and obviously just as decoration, maybe outdoor. The mosaics that we know, that have survived, that have been restored or put in museums, these will have been ones that were made for beauty more than anything. The Greeks, they would tap into their own mythology and they create like these pieces depicting Zeus, Poseidon, Triton, Aphrodite, all these retelling the stories in their own art. They're some of the most detailed mosaics, and they're dotted around various buildings in Greece. So as the old saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. And when it comes to tiles, most of Europe, North Africa, West Asia, we can all trace the tile history to Rome. So the Romans developed building materials. They were close to modern day ceramics, and they introduced these materials throughout their entire empire. With each part of the empire then, they kind of developed their own local cultural designs or their own local techniques, and then over time they would develop and become famous for their own little areas of the industry. So tiles as we would know them today, so like thin rectangles, they were probably first used by the Romans, where older tiles have been closer to like bricks. They're still tiles, but we wouldn't really know them as a tile today. It'd be more like a brick. So the Romans would adopt all these different things that they would adopt and develop from different parts of the empire. So the roof tiles are developed by the Greeks, and they'd just take it and run with it. They would use ceramic tiles for the first time to form the first form of central heating, known as hypocaust. So they'd have rooms with a multi-layered system. So they'd use ceramic tiles to maintain the heat, and they'd have these tile tubes called caliducts. So they were placed in the walls and some of the hypocausts, and it would allow heat to travel through the walls and then out of the flues and circulate hot air through the building. The amazing thing about these tubes, it's kind of like a boxing. It's not a tube, it's like a boxing. If you just imagine like a box running through the wall. So they would make these to run heat through, but they would make them like incredibly ornate and decorate them, but no one's ever going to see them. They're behind a wall, they're completely out of sight. So if you picture a hypocaust, it's basically a room on top of a room. So there's like, say, a basement underneath, and then in the basement there'll be lots of pillars to support the room above and allow lots of space in between the pillars, so this would let the heat flow all around the basement, we'll call it. What's the word? I'm going to Google what the word is for it now. There is no word for it, I just Googled it. It's just called a hypocaust basement or chamber, so I was right. I didn't really know that, I just guessed. So yeah, the pillars, they would be supporting the room above, which might have been a room with baths in it, or just somebody's house. I mean, rich people could have central heating in these days. And then in the chamber, there was a furnace, and that's where the servants would have been feeding the furnace to keep the heat flowing. And then the heat would flow in between the pillars, underfloor heating, so the floor's warm, but also the caliducts that I mentioned before, they would run up the walls. And there was all different types of tiles in these caliducts, and so on the back of them they would actually score them, so they could stick it to the wall better. So that they would score key marks on the back of the tile, so it would help to stick to the mortar better, more securely. But they'd also have all different types of designs to dissipate the heat. So the heat would be running through this tube that was in the wall, or box that was in the wall, but the different shapes of the tiles would push the heat laterally, so it would actually warm the the wall up. So they're feeding the furnace. It's filling the chamber or the basement with heat. The heat's going all around the pillars that are holding up the room above, warming the floor up, and then it's also rising up through the calidoc that's in the wall that has all these different intricate tiles in it that's dissipating the heat, so it's actually warming the room up. And as I say, that would be used for like maybe a room with a bath or baths, or just generally someone who's rich would have central heating in their house and a servant underneath keeping the furnace flowing. So one thing the Romans are probably most famous for tile-wise is the mosaics. So just like the Greeks did, they made sure they were functional. They would use them for flooring, wall coverings, but they were, and they still are to this day, some of the most intricate and beautiful designs that you'll find of mosaics. And it says a lot that we still uncover some of these pieces today, and they've been buried for thousands of years, and are still intact, and in the most part, kind of perfectly preserved. They will have made them with ceramics, marbles, glass, and seashells called tesserae, and they would have stuck them all down with mortar. So the Romans had taken what the Greeks had started and elevated it to a much higher level. It will have required like multiple masters. For a large mosaic, you would have had many masters of the trade working on it. Different artists will have been doing it, and you can actually spot when there's more than one artist who's worked on a big mosaic, because they've got slightly different styles. So if there's animals or people depicted, you can spot the different styles of the different artists who's worked over, like this artist did this bit and this artist did this bit. So the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, but many of its architectural innovations, especially tiles, they're still found throughout the world to this day, and they will have influenced everybody going forward. Around about the same time as the Greeks and the Romans were rising, falling, making tiles, the Chinese were also using glazed tiles quite extensively. So, similar to the Egyptians, an important part of Chinese culture was the afterlife. And they would furnish tombs of emperors in really elaborate ways. And they would use ceramic wall tiles, and ceramic wall tiles have been found decorating tombs. So they have like decorative relief tiles, and it would depict the emperor's life, and he'd be hunting. Or the tiles would be like faces of monsters and to ward off any evil spirits. The way that the Chinese made the relief tiles, it would have been something called reduction firing, and this is when they have a specially designed kiln. It restricts the flow of incoming air, and it'll either be just enough to burn, or in some cases not enough oxygen to burn the fuel in the kiln. So less oxygen in the kiln means more carbon, and then the carbon will steal the oxygen from wherever it can find it, so that'll be on the front of the clay, and this will cause the colour to change. It would take a lot of practice and skill to master. Obviously they've got no measuring devices or anything like that, so they're always relying on experience and skill to master that type of firing and achieve the desired colours. So the opposite of reduction firing is oxidation, so where they put too much oxygen, and that will attach itself to the metals in the clay. It would draw electrons from the clay and the glaze, and that would produce lots of other different types of colours. So kilns, the science behind kilns is really complicated, and you could really go down a rabbit hole with it, but we won't go there. But I will mention techniques and different types of kilns as we go on. So back to the monsters. So the monsters' heads, they will have been unglazed and decorated with pigments. In most cases, the pigments are no longer there, but the historians and scientists, they found traces of the pigments, and they can get an idea of what the original looked like, and they can tell us what colour they were and things like that. So the main decoration in the tombs would have been all of the emperor's possessions, including his wife, his servants, concubines, animals. They were all killed when the emperor died, so they could continue to service him in the afterlife. They literally killed people. So over time, the practice of killing actual people to be entombed with the emperor, it did eventually stop. And when we see things like the terracotta statues, there's a massive terracotta army, which is the Qin dynasty emperor. So some facts about the fun facts. The Qin dynasty terracotta army were put there about 210 BC, and they were found by accident in 1974, so they've been there untouched underground for over 2,000 years. There's no record of the work being carried out on that site, or the work being carried out to create the site. 2,000 warriors and horses have been excavated, and there's an estimated 6,000 more that are still buried. And what's really mad is, no two figures are the same. They will have all been painted, they all had real weapons, and this site has still got a lot of mysteries that we haven't quite found out yet. It's not been fully excavated or fully understood to this day. So the emperor will have wanted to live forever, and obviously he seemed to have unlimited resources that he'd create a massive underground empire. So he's got his army, palaces, stables with horses in, staff, wife, concubines. His burial site is 56 square kilometres. So maybe he was living forever. Maybe we fucked it up by digging it up. And they all just like Toy Story when they have to freeze. So as soon as we dug them up, they just freeze again. Archaeologists, they are actually afraid to excavate the actual tomb. So they've not actually excavated the tomb yet. They've just been excavating around the edges. So they'll say it's to avoid damaging it. And they're not quite sure if booby traps have been set, which is likely. I think they should leave it alone. If he really did master immortality and we go disturbing him, he's still got 6,000 more immortal warriors with him. So just leave him be. Leave him alone. The most common type of ancient Chinese tile is the roof tile. And this will have been due to the ancient architecture. So the buildings, they were basically columns that would support a large roof, and the walls didn't really have load-bearing function at all, so they were just screens. So the wall tiles didn't really feature. The roof tiles weren't normal roof tiles though. The roof would have been like a dominating feature, the famous Chinese ancient roofs. Really elaborate designs and decorations on the tiles. Really colourful. So they would have had tiles and ridge tiles, glazed ceramic figures on top, decorating the roof, like dragons, warriors, Buddhist figures. And the buildings themselves, they were mainly timber, so really ancient Chinese buildings. They're just not there. No, we can't find them anymore. They've gone. But what they will have done at the time, they will have had smaller models of the buildings in the tombs. So this is like they will have had a model of the building that guy lived in, and that depicts what the building would have looked like. And they're made out of pottery, so we do know what they actually look like. The coloured grey glaze will have been imported from India, and along with Buddhist culture. The Chinese will have had very strict rules for the use of glazed tiles, and even the colours that could be used and where. So part of the reason will have been due to the cost, but they also used it for hierarchy. So during the Qing dynasty, so non-royal, ordinary people were absolutely not allowed to use coloured glaze, and there were specific rules about the colours too. So yellow will have been imperial palaces and mausoleums, green, palaces and sacrificial buildings, black and purple will have been pavilions, terraces, imperial gardens. So around about this time as well, Japan will have been making tiles And they will have been influenced by the Chinese and the Korean. The Koreans were making tiles around about the same time as the Chinese as well. Japan would have been famous for roof tiles as well, called kawara. But they did have a tradition of making wall and floor tiles, so extremely decorative tiles. You can find them today in Japanese castles and temples. So from around the year 700, the Japanese tiles, they would become quite sophisticated by that point. And then it would be very prominent in their architecture from 1000 onwards, year 1000 onwards. Like I say, there would have been very similar techniques to the Chinese, but the designs, they would have been inspired by China and Korea, but they would have been a very unique Japanese look. So florals, animals, geometric shapes, wabi-sabi, which is like the appreciation for imperfection and finding the beauty in imperfection. That will have been an influence. So natural designs such as trees, plants. Japanese have a deep connection with the natural world. The Japanese did develop, so they will have taken the techniques of the Chinese and the Korean, and they developed some of their own. Over time, they will have developed some of their own glaze and glazing techniques. And you do get, it does give the Japanese tiles a unique artistic look. You can see some of them, so all you need to do is go to Japan, or Google these castles. Some of the ancient castles in Japan with amazing tile installations, and they will have been renovated over time and restored. And most of these are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So you've got Himeji Castle in Hyogo, Matsumoto Castle in Nagano, Osaka Castle in Osaka, Nijo Castle in Kyoto. To be honest, Japanese castles aren't really something I ever thought about, but Google them, they're worth a look. Some of the most famous tiles in history are Islamic design tiles. So Islam, it will have almost immediately started to use tiles extensively, even when it was very young, in places like mosques, palaces, colleges, shrines, and graves. So, as mentioned before, you'll find Islamic tiles all over the world. Most of the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the south of Spain. And the reason for the spread was a little bit like Christianity, invading Muslim armies, just going across these regions. So from Medina, which is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, and he's the guy who revealed the Islamic religion to the world. So they would have gone through the whole of Arabia, North Africa, Spain as mentioned, and Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Central Asia, India. They're very widespread. The production of Islamic tiles was mainly split into small family-run operations. They would set up shop near to where the raw materials were available, and they'd have these small family workshops all in the same town, so they'd share resources and they'd help each other out. There'd be some healthy competition, but that sharing of all the family workshops in one area, that helped to progress the industry within that area. South of Spain is the one that I'll keep referring to because I've been there and read about it. So they will have passed the tricks of the trade and the trade secrets from father to son. It will have ensured continuity, but it will have also kind of limited them a little bit. So small family traditional businesses, they will have been quite resistant to change. So even if new methods came along and they were proven, any little change will have been resisted. And the only time big changes will have happened, and this is a lot of things in history actually, the only time big changes happen is when they're actually forced to happen. So they will have been forced to due to like war. So the workers will be forced to be slaves for new masters, and they were like the spoils of war, so to speak. So as mentioned, Islamic tiles are some of the most beautiful and most significant in the whole history of tiles. And you can you can kind of split the development of Islamic tiles into 4 main decoration techniques: luster decorations, mosaics, cuerda seca, and underglaze painting. They will have used each one of these to produce these lavish, stylish tiles, and even to this day, probably the most stylish tiles that we've seen. So luster, that was a technique developed by Islamic potters. They would combine metal compounds like silver and copper with the glazed tile, so when fired, it produced like a thin, iridescent metallic surface, and that would reflect the light. So it's thought that they learned this technique from glassmakers. So glassmakers will have been using copper and silver lusters to decorate glass in Egypt from about the 4th century. And they will have passed on skills or seen people doing this when they were probably learning about or communicating or trading with kiln makers, because kiln makers will have been speaking to both trades. It's an extremely difficult technique to master. It took a while to spread around, so initially it was only really done in Iraq in the 9th century. It would have eventually spread to Egypt in about the 11th century, then Syria, then Iran in about the 12th century, and then eventually by the 14th century to Valencia. So we're back to Valencia, which at the time will have been in Moorish Spain. So Moor was the word used by Christian Europeans and to refer to Muslims or Muslim areas. So Valencia became really famous for its luster, and we know to this day Spain and that area is massively important for the tile industry, and that region about them will have become famous for its luster. Still important to this day, as I say, for manufacturing, specifically the Castellon region, which is part of Valencia. So that's generations and generations of skills and heritage have been passed down. So if you to visit the region, you'll find influence of Islam and Christianity. And as I say, some churches used to be mosques, or some church sites were on the sites of old mosques. And you can see the design influence of both sometimes in the same place, Islam and Christianity. So some of the best examples of mosaic tiles we can find in Islamic architecture. So from about the 12th century, the production and use of mosaics, it was used extensively for mosques, palaces, shrines, and colleges, and religious colleges and things like that. You'll find them everywhere, all throughout, like I mentioned before, all the Islamic world, so Iran, India, Morocco, Spain. Muslim potters, they developed on mosaics, the art of mosaics, which the Romans introduced, and they will have introduced much more colourful finishes and intricate shapes. So their holy shrines and mosques are perhaps the best examples. As mentioned, the Moorish architecture in Spain, you can still see it to this day, and I keep mentioning it because I've actually physically seen it. And a good example of mosaics that anybody can go to is the Great Mosque in Cordoba. It's also known as the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption because it's not a mosque anymore. Or some people call it the Mosque Cathedral. So it's another example of an old Islamic site in Spain that was converted into a Catholic one. And there's large areas of mosaics that we can see now that they were originally lost or covered up. They were restored in around the 19th century. If you want to see some absolutely incredible and it's actually important mosaic installations, it can be seen at the Dome of the Rock of Palestine, which is an Islamic shrine in Jerusalem. I had to Google that one, I haven't been there. You have the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. It contained the largest example of gold mosaics ever, So it's about 4,000 square meters. It was damaged at some point by fire, but they've restored some of it, and I believe they're continuing to restore it. That particular mosque has got massive mosaic installations. It's worth Googling and having a look at it. It's absolutely incredible. So the third technique of Islamic tile making is Querda seca. So it will have first been developed in the 14th century in Asia and Iran. Querda seca, it means dry cord, is when lines are painted onto the tile with a greasy substance. It's usually a manganese oxide mixed with grease. They would then fill the area between the lines with a coloured glaze. And the lines that have been painted on, they would keep the water-based glaze separate from each other. So when they fire the tiles, the grease burns away and it leaves like a dark sunken outline around the glaze, which didn't mix with each other because it was separated by the grease. So what the Islamic designers would do, they would use this to simulate kind of interlacing mosaic patterns over like massive areas, mainly because it was quicker and cheaper than actually doing each lane and each mosaic piece separately. You'll find like intricate floral designs as well using this method. The fourth Islamic technique, underglaze. So this was used fairly extensively in Islamic tiles. So the paint was applied before the glaze, and the glaze would have been like a thin, transparent glaze. It gave the artist a lot more freedom, so they could use like different types of brushes and produce like intricate artwork. It was actually first done by Chinese potters, and the Islamic potters learned it from them. There's lots and lots of examples of the famous blue and white pottery. But they did use that for tiles as well, but I think famous Chinese pottery was that blue and white, and that's an underglaze painting. So the goal was to try and match the quality of the Chinese porcelain. And to be honest, I think the goal to this day would be still to try and match that quality. So initially, the Islamic tile makers, they couldn't do it. And it was simply because they don't have access to the same materials that the Chinese had access to. So the highest quality blue and white porcelain out of China will have been the Ming period, the Ming vases and all that. It was around the 14th century. And that was always been the benchmark. What they started to do in mosques was use different shapes. So hexagonal shaped underglazed tiles, they started to be used. You'll find examples in mosques. You'll find examples in mosques such as the Murad II mosque in Turkey. So that's the first time we've mentioned Turkey as well. And this is when the start of higher quality tile making in the 16th and 17th century, specifically in Iznik in Turkey. And that region to this day is very important to the tile industry. And you'll see that I keep mentioning regions that have survived, ancient regions that have survived, that were once important and still are to this day. Obviously, I'm British. We were important once in tiles, but we're not anymore. So all these regions around the world holding on to their manufacturing legacy to this day. If only Britain could have done the same. With not just tiles, all of our industries. So Iznik became famous for tiles. If you just Google Iznik tiles, have a look at some of the designs. It's literally the potters of Iznik. They would have switched to making tiles when this new knowledge and materials was made available to them. So all Islamic tiles will have been kiln fired, mostly used for architectural purposes. The main types of kilns that they used were called beehive kilns. So these are about an oval shape, about 3 meters high, look like a beehive, and they will have used the updraft method. So basically, there's a flame or heat. It's at the base or bottom or underneath the kiln, and the exhaust is at the top. So it's a beehive, flame underneath, exhausted out of the top. So the firebox will have been below ground level, and the kiln would have had a brick floor. The heat could rise up through, and the temperature was controlled by capping the top with a stone, and you could move it around. And inside the chamber, they will have had fixed rods, so they could make shelves out of them, so they could rest the ceramics on the shelves. The complete process of loading, firing, and cooling with that type of kiln would have taken about a week, and the temperature control and things like smoke control, so more smoke would be required for lusterware. It was controlled by experience, basically. There's nothing to measure it, so experience and skill is the only way that they could produce what they wanted to produce. So from about the 9th century, and then hundreds of years, thousands of years on, Islamic tiles were made throughout the world. And even still to this day, so thousands of years later, those areas are still hugely important as tile manufacturers. And some of those areas aren't even classed as Islamic anymore. So it just shows you that the amount of time that we're talking in history, it's enough time for whole countries to have changed their main religion. So multiple generations of people continue to make tiles, perhaps not even realising why tiles are so integral to their region, or why tiles are in their blood. Just going to have a little break now, just to remind everybody that this podcast is completely independent. It actually costs money to create this podcast. It makes no money at all at the moment, so the goal is to eventually get the podcast to pay for itself. And we've set up a Patreon, which is a website or an app that lets people pay a subscription if they want to. You don't have to. It's just a way for you to support the podcast if you enjoy the podcast. It's free to listen to. If you're willing to pay the price of a coffee, like buy me a cup of coffee every month, then that would be great. If we can get enough people to do that, then maybe one day I can start making these podcasts more regular. So if you go to patreon.com/Don't Touch the Cat, and you can subscribe there. Thanks very much. Back to the podcast. In the early 13th century, we started to see medieval tiles in Britain, France, and Germany. Now, since the fall of the Roman Empire, the architecture in England and most of Europe, it was much more basic, perhaps for even a few hundred years, until materials like stone started to be used again, particularly in churches. In churches, or for the very wealthy in palaces and villas, and you get ornamental stone, marble, mosaics being used. Mosaics were still, obviously, the influence of the Roman Empire, but it would have been extremely expensive, and most people just had to make do with floors made of nothing, so the earth was your floor. And that was perhaps the driver for the introduction of ceramic floor tiles. So raw materials were available and could be worked by potters who will have had the necessary skill set. Other materials being used by the rich will have been imported and just out of reach of the vast majority of society. Medieval stone tiled floors had already been used in churches and cathedrals, which we're able to go and see today if we wanted to. It's perhaps my personal favourite in the history of everything. And it probably is because we're able to visit the buildings, the amazing buildings that they're in, and actually walk on the floor. I do like the style though. What they were able to do with stone is really good. It's absolutely amazing, really. The stone tiled floors were the inspiration for the first truly medieval ceramic tiles. Medieval tile making was seasonal, and it would have been done in workshops that were located near to the places where the raw materials were. So things like clay and water, as well as wood for the fire. in the kilns, lime deposits to make the mortar to actually install the tiles. So local clay would have been dug up and allowed to weather during the winter months, with the manufacture taking place during the drier months. The tiles would have been hand pressed with wooden moulds that had no base, and they were rested in like a sanded base to prevent the clay from sticking. And then once they were pressed, any overflow on the top of the mould was scraped off with a wire bow and then smoothed off with a wet piece called a strike. So imagine like a box with no top or bottom laid on a surface and then filled with as much clay as possible, pressed in by hand, and then the surplus scraped off the top, level with the height of the walls of the mould, and then the top would just be smoothed off. Sometimes marks were made in the back of the tile by stabbing or scooping out little bits, and that would just leave like a surface that would allow the mortar to stick to better. The tile would be tipped out of the mould, and then they would let it dry. And they actually, even in them days, they had an allowance of around 10% to allow for shrinkage while firing. It wasn't particularly accurate though, it was based more on experience than measurement. If they needed to make small tiles, which would probably be about the same tiles size as our metros today, or any shapes like triangles, they wouldn't cut the shapes out first. What they would do is they would score that shape into the tile, but with a deeper score than usual. So when it came out of the kiln, it could just be broken off at the score lines. It would have been difficult or probably impossible to make the small tile from the outset, and a lot more difficult to stack it in the kiln. Medieval tile makers would use a transparent lead glaze in most cases. That's all they had available to them. It was fairly basic material to work with, but the tile makers did devise ways of making different colours with this type of glaze. Just applying the glaze itself, it would generally make the red clay that they were using look like a brownish colour. They would coat the surface of the tile with things like slip clay to achieve a yellowy colour, copper oxide to the glaze to get a greenish glaze, and then they play around with these two methods to get various shades of green. Very dark black colours were achieved by using copper saturated lead glaze. The glaze was applied directly to the unfired tile, and then they'd fire both at the same time to save time and cost. The kilns that they would have been using would have been very basic structures. They're just made out of brick and waste tiles. They would have been rectangular in shape, with some arches and chambers at the bottom. So the arches for strength, and the chambers at the bottom were fire chambers. From the front, on the outside, it would basically look like a block made out of bricks with some arches at the bottom where the fires were stoked. There was no roof to the kiln, but they will have covered it with like temporary materials like old tiles just to contain the heat. Just like modern tile making really, it was important for them to get the temperature right. They would have had to get it to around 1,000 degrees Celsius, but they didn't know that. They had no way of measuring it, so it relied entirely on experience and guesswork. Batches of tiles would vary quite a bit because it's all guesswork, so just bear that in mind for later on when we look at modern tile making and why some batches seem to be better than others. It's not a million miles away from this. Controls, skill sets at the factories. As I say, the medieval type tiles are some of my personal favourites, and maybe one reason is because of the randomness of them, something that a modern tiler would not thank you for. Although the tile makers will have only had very basic tools and methods, they were able to make some pretty cool looking tiles. They could add colour as mentioned. They could make tiles with different shapes, and they could use moulds to get some kind of relief patterns into the tiles as well. Somewhere fairly local to me that you can go to see these kinds of tiles is Lichfield Cathedral in Staffordshire. It's got perfect examples of medieval floor tiles and architecture. So it is a good fact for the tiler. So during the 13th century, tile makers would travel around from site to site and work for royal clients and charge a day rate. So they would make the tiles and probably fit them as well. So I doubt very much that they took the piss on a day rate. It's because they will have been working for a customer. They wouldn't have had any customer complaints. They probably would have just been publicly shamed or flogged or some fucking horrific torture as corporal punishment at the very worst. So as I say, tiles would have been made on site for large buildings like abbeys. There's no way the tiles would have survived any kind of transport over long distances, and this is why a lot of abbeys are built near to rivers and places where clay can be found more easily. And once the tile makers were done in a particular area on a particular project, they'd leave the kilns there, so that area then, there would probably already be some local potters in that area, and they will have been working as assistants to these tile makers. And they would have picked up new skills, and then they've actually left a little tile industry in that area behind. And towards the end of the 13th century, tile making started to get a little bit more commercialised. So some kind of standards started to take shape by then, and this allowed tiles to be made more quickly. And the tile making would have been done in regions rather than super duper locally. The roads were extremely poor. They weren't ideal for transporting tiles, so they would have used waterways as much as possible. Then the tile workers would have been, the tile makers in those little workshops or mini factories, they would have been working on piecework, and would start to see the beginning of the working man being taken advantage of. To make any kind of living from piecework, you have to be fast, and then that's going to affect the quality. And then they would have been heavily punished for poor quality work as well, and absolutely no way of arguing against it. So I'd wager personally that there were quite a few unfairly penalised at that time by the bosses or customers. It's not that different really to modern QA departments. So a modern QA department will have started out with all the best will in the world, but as with everything these days, it turns into targets to make money. So they will have started out of, like I say, all the best will in the world to make sure everything was the best quality at every step of the way. But then that turns into something wasn't quite right, so we're going to fine you. I just did air quotes. So we're fining you for, I don't know, damaged box, late delivery, damaged pallet, wrong pallet, whatever. And that turns into targets. So they've gone from being a QA department where the target is to make sure everything's good quality to a QA department that makes sure they get and fine as many people as possible for as many silly little things. So around this time, we've started to see big players emerge in the manufacturing of tiles. They started to figure out how to make tiles more quickly and how to transport them around the country better. So the main type of tile that the medieval tile makers were making, historically famous for the two coloured tiles, they would be made in the usual way, using the same mould, trimming the waste, smooth out the top. Then they would add another wood mould that had like a carved pattern onto it, and they'd use this as like a stamp. They'd press that onto the tile, and it would create a relief within the design of the stamp. So they would fill that relief with a different colour clay than what the main tile was, and then they would coat everything with a transparent glaze. There's lots of examples. They're usually red or white, but they use red or white clay. So once glazed, it can look like a brownish and with a white contrast. They kind of look brown and beige these days if you see an old one. The traditional dates used for the end of medieval times, or the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, was around about the end of the 15th century. It marks the end of the period of the time after the fall of Rome, but before the early modern era and the Renaissance. So we saw things like Christopher Columbus' first voyage to the Americas, the fall of Constantinople when the Ottoman Empire captured it, the Protestant Reformation where Martin Luther famously nailed his thesis to the door of a Catholic church. In England, historians will refer to the Battle of Bosworth. It was the last big battle of the War of the Roses, which was between the houses of Lancaster and York. Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, with Richard being the last English monarch to die in combat. So all of these and other events around the world can be used by different countries to mark the end of the period. And they're all really interesting things to look at in their own right. Just give them a Google and have a look at it. Tile-wise, we see the Renaissance as a period of tile making that produced some of the most interesting developments in the industry. Some of those beautiful tiles, there was leaps in technology used to manufacture tiles at this time. It's referred to as the Golden Age. So this period of tile making introduced a method of tin glazing known by different names in different countries. It was called Delftware in England. To put it simply, it allowed tile makers to cover the surface of the tile completely with a brilliant white glaze, so it would cover up all of the colour of the clay completely, and then it would then allow other really colourful paints to be used, and you can basically create any design that the artist wanted to. Then they had a blank white canvas. Tin glaze was made of lead oxide with tin oxide added to it, and it would turn the original transparent glaze into an opaque white. There was an absolute explosion of tile making and innovation in England, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland and Italy, and each country would develop their own techniques and styles. So as discussed earlier, the centre of tin glazed tiles in Spain was Valencia. It still had this hybrid of Islamic Christian style designs being developed, obviously due to the history of the region. It was Moorish, it's now Christian, and a lot of the Islamic tile makers still lived in the area, and they would either convert to Christianity or be forced to do so, and some of them would actually remain as a Moor. Portugal really adopted tin glazing as a national art form, and if you visit Portugal today, you don't have to look far at all. There's tiles literally everywhere. Italian tin glazing, called miolica. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. It was initially the Italian tile makers copying the Spanish and Islamic designs that had been imported from Valencia. They would make it to Italy via Majorca, which might be where the name miolica comes from, but it's not 100% clear. So the Italians, over time, they would develop their own style and techniques, and they would take it to another level, and it would actually become the best and most important region in Europe for this type of tile making. The early Italian tin glazed tiles, they were mainly copper green, white, dark purple, something which they would develop and eventually just produce a wide range of every colour possible, very high quality range of tiles as well. What they would do is they would paint directly onto the unfired tin glaze. Now, this was a new method. It didn't allow for mistakes because the colours immediately absorbed by the glaze. And then what would happen is they would fire the tiles for a second time, so that these tiles would get fired twice, and an additional transparent glaze would be applied over the top. This made the tiles like a bit extra, and we hadn't seen it before. The tiles would mainly be used on floors, and there's lots of examples of them that have been preserved in various buildings in Italy and the International Ceramics Museum in Italy. You can also find Italian preserved floors in the British Museum. It will have been high Renaissance art on the Italian tiles. It would have been depicting like religious scenes for church tiles, and then naturalism art on friezes that they made. So they were trying to get art as realistic as possible onto tiles, and they'd use it for like decorative banners. So tin glazing passed from Spain to Italy, but then the new methods that the Italians came up with was passed back to Spain. So you will have had Italian potters visiting or going to live in Spain, and then a lot of the tiles that were made in Spain, so the Spanish tiles, they were made by Italian artists, and they will have been using the new methods and a wider range of vivid colours. By about the 17th century, you'd start to see massive scenes, like massive works of art stretched over multiple tiles, and the Portuguese were particularly good at this, and they would have been inspired by the Spanish and the Italians And as I mentioned before, to this day, the industry in Portugal is hugely important. It's perhaps the most tile-heavy country in Europe. The Italian maiolica technique, it would eventually spread everywhere, Britain, all throughout Europe. And in Britain, we know the colourful stove tiles. You may have seen them, but they will have been more popular in places like Germany and Switzerland. So that maiolica technique, it was spread to Holland too. Immigrant potters probably imported the skills there. So the Dutch mainly concentrated on putting this type of tile on the wall. The glaze on the floor tended to wear if it was used too much, and where previously it was being used by the rich, where they could just literally keep people off their floor or just replace a tile if it was needed. The Dutch was having a bit of a middle class boom, so the middle class wanted tiles in the homes. In the 17th century, there was more and more people that could afford tiles, so it was more appealing because it was more hygienic. In Holland, a lot of homes were next to water, so this would cause a lot of issues with damp. So tiles were used in cellars and kitchens as like skirting, and it will have been the Dutch who introduced the tin glazing to England. So Dutch and Flemish potters will have moved to England and just set up businesses. And by that time, any tiles that were being made in England were competed with tiles imported from Holland. So the Dutch tiles tended to be a little bit thinner, easier to handle, just a little bit better quality. So the made in England tiles, they would look as good as the Dutch tiles, but the Dutch had been developing techniques that let them work with the clay and make the tiles thinner. And it was such a problem in England for the Delftware industry that the English industry started to decline quite a lot. And there was actually a ban imposed in 1672 on any tiles imported from Holland. So that would be similar to an anti-dumping tax or something that we'd see these days. They literally banned imports from Holland because it was such a problem for the English tile makers. It took decades for the industry in Britain to catch up, even after the ban. So it did grow, and you'd start to see major factories, proper factories would develop in London, Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow. They'd be basically making Dutch Delftware, but in Britain. During the 18th century, you started to see Josiah Wedgwood and Josiah Spode, both from Stoke-on-Trent, born not that far away from where I'm sitting right now, and they were manufacturing pottery to like a whole new standard, and they'd been growing as such that they'd basically killed off all of the competition in England, Scotland, Holland, and around Europe. So the products they were producing was far superior to Delftware, so pottery that was far superior to Delftware. And by 1800, most of the other pottery makers were out of business. So I mentioned before, particularly Spain, Italy, and Turkey, mainly because we now import their tiles, they clung on to their industry. It's just a shame that Britain couldn't do that, bearing in mind Wedgwood and Spode, they're big names, people will know those names. The pottery industry really stings as it's such a historical and economic importance to this area, particularly where I live, and we've just basically let it die. It's not the only industry in Britain that's died, but for Stoke-on-Trent it's a shame, because we had a world-leading industry and we somehow fucked it up. We don't even try to hold on to the history for the most part, or at least the powers that be don't. We'll have museums and various things, but we don't really take advantage of this area was the world leader at something. I even think at one point, not so long ago, the king now, he would have been the prince at the time, he had to get involved to make sure that Middleport Pottery in Stoke didn't close down. There's a handful of companies left, but it's more specialised market now. It's like they're sporadically spread out, where it would have been literally everywhere back in the day. There will have been 100,000 workers at one point, and I'm not even sure if that figure includes the support industries, so tool makers and raw material suppliers, shops, and things supporting the workers that will have been also concentrated in the area. And I think these days it would be kind if you said there was between 5 and 10,000 working in the industry. And that if you bear in mind the city's population now is about 250,000, all the other major industries that are in this region have disappeared as well. It's not difficult to see why the area is so run down. Like I think I mentioned before, there's this hunger for profit. It's totally ruined any historical important industry. I'm sure there's lots of stories like that around the country as well. The skills are still there, and history is still here. It's still recognised as the ceramics capital of the world, and there's still some companies left, but on a much, much smaller scale. And the companies that are left, to be fair to them, they're working hard to try and build it back to even a little bit of what it was previously. I mentioned Josiah Wedgwood and Josiah Spode. They were both like pioneers of what we call now the Industrial Revolution, which will have started in the 18th century, about 1760. So Wedgwood was a major driver of the Industrial Revolution. So that's a period where it will have had a massive impact on all industries. So we saw like rapid progression from handmade to industrial machine-made products. So water and steam-powered factories would start popping up everywhere. I mean, you get much more efficient production lines, and the technical skills, they'd be broken down and divided throughout the factory onto production lines. So it's kind of the beginning and the end of the skilled worker. So the machines didn't need highly skilled workers. They produced more. They were more efficient. So there was, in fact, initially, there was a reduction in quality of life for the skilled worker. And then over time, this is generally speaking, over time, a middle class did emerge. And then you started to get white collar roles, higher wages for workers, and eventually higher wages for workers. But I'm talking over a long period of time. You'd start to see early forms of unions. That's a completely whole other conversation. We'll have that another day. So tile-wise, as with most industries really, tile-wise, what the Industrial Revolution meant was a move away from handmade and hand-decorated tiles to industrial presses to make the tiles and transfer printing to decorate them. During this time, there was also a massive increase in demand for tiles, so cities were growing rapidly. Loads more bathrooms, loads more toilets, kitchens, fireplaces, and obviously loads more factories, schools, factories, hospitals, hotels, railway stations. There was a lot going on, so it was a good time for the tile industry. We started to see building standards being introduced as well, so building regulations will call for certain areas to be more hygienic. It's great for the tile industry. So the tile makers, they'd obviously been around for a while, so they were experienced, so they'd seen all these previously handmade, really high art tiles, and it wasn't lost on them that now they got all these machines, industrial machines, and they were brilliant but producing perhaps quite boring products. So they started to employ artists, and then the artists themselves had to learn about the machinery and what was possible, and then they becoming kind of design engineers or artistic engineers. This is where Britain really started to lead the way with industrial tile production, with Europe and the United States not too far behind, and this is the first time we've mentioned that the United States, they perhaps enter tile history for the first time in the mid to late 19th century. So they will have been following the lead of Britain and Europe, using British technology and British and European immigrants to help contribute to their own boom in tile making. Colonisation. So before colonisation in the Americas, there was already people there. I think sometimes people forget there were many indigenous cultures who'd been experimented themselves, and they were actually skilled at pottery, but not really tile making as we would know them today, or not that we're aware of. So maybe the closest indigenous cultures in the Americas that got to tile, something that resembled a tile, will have been the Aztecs and the Incas. So Aztecs, we know, Mexico, and Incas would have been Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile and Argentina. They had quite a large empire, the Incas. So they were making decorative ceramics. They might have looked like tiles, but they're not really as what we would consider a tile today. The other indigenous cultures of Americas, they just didn't have a need for tiles as we know them today. So what we would now call Canada and the United States, you would have had numerous indigenous First Nations people. They would have been skilled potters, but they just weren't making tiles. So before 1492, which is really difficult to research anything before then anyway, it's unlikely that there was a tile making tradition in the Americas. After 1492, we started to see colonization. So we had Spain colonizing Mexico. They conquered the Inca Empire. Portugal colonizing Brazil. France went for Canada. England for North America. And the first colony for England was Jamestown in Virginia. England did have lots and lots of failed attempts to colonize elsewhere. The Dutch set up New Netherland, which would be some of modern-day New York. The Swedish, they actually set up a colony in Delaware. It didn't last very long, but it's really interesting thing to read about. So it collapsed, from what I can tell, by the Swedish Empire just losing interest in it. They were at war with the Netherlands at the time, so they didn't send any supplies, and eventually the Dutch just took it from them. But it's an interesting one to read about. The Russians colonized Alaska, and they didn't actually lose it. They sold it to the United States in 1867 for $7.2 million at the time. So that's about $151 million today, which is a fucking great deal. So Alaska's GDP is now $65 billion per year. So to be fair to them, the resources that it has now, they just wouldn't have been known about at the time. And even if they did know about oil, it just wasn't as valuable then. The value in Alaska at the time was fur trade. And that itself was diminishing because they'd basically done so much of it that most of the animals have been driven to extinction anyway. So, but even with that, the United States made back that investment within 10 years from fur alone. So it was considered cut price then, but the Russians really couldn't sell it to anybody else. They only really had Britain that might have been interested and could afford it. And Britain would have been more likely to just take it, which sounds very British. It's unlikely the Russians would have wanted to sell to Britain anyway, even if they offered, as they'd been at war not long before. So they were worried about the British, got ripped off by the United States. Sounds about right. So as I was reading about this, so all these immigrants going to the United States, it reminded me of the TV program 1883. It's a spin-off of that other one, Yellowstone. It's really, really good actually. 1883 it's called. So there's Russians and Germans in that. I think Dutch as well. And probably lots of others travelling to find new life in the land of opportunity at the time. So one of the Germans said to one of the cowboys that they couldn't swim because it was illegal in Germany. I was like, what? So obviously I had to look it up. And it's true, but it's not quite accurate for that period of time. So it's a true statement. It was true in Germany, but it was a little bit before 1883. So what happened was, so many people were drowning in the river Danube, that they just decided to make swimming illegal rather than teach people how to swim. And what they'd do is, if they found a drowned body, they would still punish the body. So they'd whip the body and then bury it. So anyway, back to the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is a period when tiles really, really became for everyone really, and not just the elite or for ornamental grand buildings or churches and cathedrals. So the market for tiles was absolutely massive. Every type of tile was being made and all markets catered for. The new production techniques, it allowed for every type of tile or any type of tile to be made really quickly. So functional floors, functional walls, or highly decorative or art installations, anything was possible at this point. So painting by hand was kind of out by then. Transfer printing was the thing that was in. So an image was transferred to a tin glazed tile from like a gelatin sheet. So that had been pressed onto a copper plate that had been engraved with whatever the desired design was. So early examples, they'd be quite monochrome in colour, that they're either red, black or blue. And then the tiles were fired again at lower temperatures to make the decorations permanent. So this is where we get Wedgwood and Spode come back in. So they would develop new techniques that it allowed more colours to be used, and it allowed the tiles to be stronger because of the innovations with the actual material that these guys were doing. So Wedgwood basically is a genius in many areas. One of them was engineering, so he was developing new types of clay and bodies that were much stronger than what anyone had seen before, and he called it creamware. And it was mainly used for pottery, but it was also being used for tiles. And what Spode would do, he was developing new ways of printing, so he was able to transfer print under the glaze, and it basically guaranteed the print to last for as long as the glaze or as long as the tile. There was a bit of a revival in caustic tiles, and this was because historians at the time, they would have an interest in medieval history, so they would find old Gothic tiles, and those designs would then inspire tile makers to make new versions of these tiles, and that movement was called the Gothic Revival. And caustic tiles, they were made from different colour clays, so rather than printing the design, the different colours of the clay themselves would make the design. And it was probably made most famous by another Stoke-on-Trent businessman named Herbert Minton. So Minton was a ceramics manufacturer, but he was like a bit of an entrepreneur. He knew about patents, and what he did was he knew about a patent that was taken out by another Stoke-on-Trent tile maker named Samuel Wright for the manufacture of ornamental floor tiles. So what Minton did, he did a deal with Wright, and he would make tiles on license and then pay royalties to Wright. So what Minton kind of pioneered was screw presses. So it would press the design into the clay with great pressure by screwing it in, and then the pressed area was filled with a different colour clay, which would have been poured or pasted in, and then they were levelled off and put into ceramic boxes called saggers, and then fired in large bottle kilns. So if Stoke does still have one thing, at least we still have some of these bottle kilns that you can actually look at. They may be derelict, but at least you can look at them. So I mentioned saggers, and the only reason I mentioned saggers is so I can talk about a really great and probably now quite famous job title, a sagger maker's bottom knocker. So we know what a sagger is. It's a ceramic box that gets put into the kiln. But there would have been skilled men that made these saggers. Making the base of the sagger, that will not have been a skilled job, and that would have been done by young boys. So what they did was, they basically beat a lump of clay with a tool called a mow, and it's spelled M-A-W-L. It's basically a large mallet. It looked like a very long banjo. And what they would do, they beat all of the air out of the base, and it produced a flat piece of clay, and that would be the base of the sagger. So they called it a mow, even though it's spelled M-A-W-L, M-A-W-L. I'm pretty sure that's because of the Stoke accent. So, for example, we would call a ball a bow, and a wall a woe. So it probably just stuck that they were calling a maul a mow. I don't know. It's not something I can find, but I'm pretty sure that's the reason it's called a mow and not a maul. The saga maker would have been working on piecework. He would have had 2 assistants. So a frame maker who was probably an older teenager, and he would have been an apprentice, and then a bottom knocker, saga maker's bottom knocker, and that was probably a young boy, and he would have paid the lads from his own wages. So Minton's was like a big deal at the time. He was hugely successful at the time with his encaustic tiles, and they were used on massive projects like Temple Church in London. They wanted to replicate medieval tiles that they found at Westminster Abbey. The Houses of Parliament have got Minton tiles, and you can go and see them today. They're over massive areas. The patent that he was licensing, it did eventually run out in the 19th century, and then that opened the floodgates for more people to start making similar tiles, but Minton was always the major player, even after that. After Minton's death, his nephew Colin Minton Campbell would take over on the China side of things, and then another nephew named Michael Daintree Hollins, so we know that name, Minton Hollins, he would take over the tile side of things. They'd eventually start their own businesses, and they'd argue for years over the name Minton. They'd have lots of legal wranglings, and eventually only one tile company with the name Minton was left, and that was Minton Hollins and Co. So Minton Hollins, if you know tiles, that's a really famous name to this day. And they were very protective of that Minton name, they were correct, because even to this day it's very famous. The main Minton factory, so that would have been a pottery factory, was demolished in the 90s. That's what I mean about Stoke. We don't even try to hold on to the history. And then another factory was demolished in the early 2000s. The Minton Company was merged with Royal Doulton in the 60s, and they themselves later on were acquired by Waterford Wedgwood Group. So Wedgwood is still around, it's still a big name, and it's now called Waterford Wedgwood Group. The tile works, so the Minton Hollins tile works, was almost demolished in the 80s, but thankfully around about that time it was listed, and it's still there now. Even if it's just rented out office space, but at least it's still there. And I think actually the building itself as offices was auctioned off a couple of years ago. I remember reading about it, but I don't know what happened to it, and I can't find any information about who owns it now or what they're doing there. The Minton Hollins name was acquired by Johnson's Tiles in the 60s, and they still produce tiles to this day with the Minton Hollins name. So as I mentioned before, the presses, Herbert Minton was probably, or definitely, I'd say, the main reason why dust presses were used for tiles. So as I mentioned before, he was a savvy businessman. He bought a stake in a patent for a press, which wasn't really designed for tiles, it was designed for buttons and materials. But he saw this and he was like, So the press was invented by Richard Prosser, Englishman. And as soon as the patent was granted, Minton was like already making tiles with the presses. So it was like a large wheel that was used to screw down a plate and apply massive pressure to whatever was underneath it. So as I said, Minton was always on the lookout for new technologies and new ways of doing things. And again, he bought a share of a new method that was invented by F.W.M. Collins and A. Reynolds. And it was basically printing colours onto a transfer paper. And that was taken from metal plates, and it became known as block printing. So the design would be carved into the block, and then the block is then coated with ink or paint, and then that's pressed onto the surface of the tiles to create a pattern. Another printing method around about this time was lithographic printing. It was a bit more complicated, and it involved drawing the image onto the stone. So what they would do is they would draw the image onto the stone with like a greasy substance, and then they would wet the surface and roll over like a greasy ink, and it would only stick to the greasy design that they'd drawn onto the stone, and then they'd transfer that to paper and then transfer that to the tile. So one of the companies that took up or pioneered this method was Craven Dunhill, another name that we know, historical name in the UK. They started up business a little bit later than everyone else, so around 1870 they started, and they would manufacture tiles in Shropshire. They'd stop making tiles there and close in 1951, but then brilliantly they would return in the year 2000 and start making tiles again using the traditional Victorian methods. And what it does now is it operates as a manufacturing site and a museum. From the late 19th century to the early 20th century, this is like a period that became known as the Second Industrial Revolution, or the Technological Revolution. And this is like the peak of British industry. It's only downhill from here. So you get like telegraphs, railroads, gas, water, sewage. Eventually you get electricity and telephones. Standardization was creeping in. Production lines, pioneered by Henry Ford. And this all allowed, this is like the beginning of globalization. And then World War One butted in and halted everything and changed everything. So industrial tile manufacturing, it just continued to develop better and more efficient ways due to things like gas, power, electricity, automation, so more automated production lines. So where previously I've mentioned a few times, there's a lot of experience and guesswork required. And to be honest, even to this day, without that experience and knowing what you're doing, even with all the measurement devices, I still think you can fuck it up when you're making tiles. But what they'd done at the time, they'd gone from total reliance on experience and guesswork for things like temperature, shrinking allowance, and all things like that. And all these things, they can start to measure it, and things will be perfect. Right, yeah, maybe not. So, the early 20th century, that's when we first saw the subway tile then. So not surprisingly, it was first made in America, in New York, for the New York subways. They had a brief that the subways needed to be beautiful and clean, so this is what they came up with. So around about that time is the Art Deco movement, so the subway tile then was popular within that movement and other art movements as well. And then later on, beveled edges were introduced. So the original subway tiles were totally flat, which meant they were easier to clean, which is that brief that they were working to. There was a period, so subway tiles have always been really popular from the moment they existed until now, where they're very popular again. But there was a period when the popularity reduced slightly, so mosaics and glass tiles were becoming more popular. But then eventually, like, minimalist design became fashionable again, so the subway tile returned, and actually now it's more popular than ever. I'm not sure, but as I was reading, I'm thinking, so initially subways were like brand new, cool, everyone loved them, but then later, not that long, let's say a few decades later, they weren't so new and they weren't so clean, and maybe people started to associate subway tiles with like filth and rats, so the tiles maybe lost a little bit of the charm because they weren't being associated with cleanliness anymore. Another famous thing that was tiled in the early 20th century, and another famous bit of history, is the Titanic. So the ship's first class areas, they would have been filled with tiles from Minton's, as we talked about, so really fancy Minton's tiles. He would have been like a big name at the time. Still is, but at the time. So all the first class areas, including the famous grand staircase, it would have had like very intricately decorated Minton's tiles. I saw a post on this on Facebook the other day, but somebody posted one of the third class or the lower class tiles, and people were like, wow, what about the weight? But they're actually linoleum tiles. They look nice. They actually look really nice. I've seen the posts, but they weren't heavy or anything. They were purposely light, and they're like medieval inspired designs. They would have been much cheaper. Those areas much more focused on function and resilience rather than design. But actually, if you look up the barber shop on the Titanic, that's one of the tiles that somebody posted on Facebook the other day, in their linoleum. But they actually look really nice. Versus today, for a functional area on a ship, we'd probably paint the floor. That barber shop looks really nice with like nice medieval inspired designs on the floor. Third class or public area, maybe not third class, but a public area on the ship. So up until this point, I've been making comments and just kind of washing over decades, or maybe even spanning hundreds of years sometimes with a single comment. There's so much history, it's so long, I've had to skirt over some of it. What I'll do for the next section, I'll try and do it decade by decade up until modern day. So we're into the 20th century. So the 20th century had 2 world wars, multiple other wars, rapid advancements in technology like we'd never seen it before. Electricity, computers, cars, nuclear bombs. We went to fucking space. So imagine telling tile makers in the 19th century that their kids or grandkids would probably get to see the moon. They wouldn't believe you. It would have been, to them at the time, Jules Verne was writing about stuff like that, and it would have been total fantasy, not even science fiction. It would have been a Jules Verne fantasy novel, not realistic in the slightest. And then actually, one of their grandkids probably went to space. And believe it or not, ceramic tiles do feature in space travel. We'll talk about it in part 2 of this podcast. So part 1 started in 4000 BC, ended in space travel, and part 2 is going to start at the First World War. Bye everybody.